So this is going to be a two-part video. We're going to be talking about the types of data in the first part, and in the second part we're going to talk about some simple graphical displays. So let's first talk about a variable. Now, any characteristic whose value may change from one individual to another is known as a variable. Now, suppose we want to know the average GPA of high school graduates in the nation this year. Define the variable of interest here. The variable of interest is the GPA of high school graduates. Variables can be things like the brand of calculator or brand of computer that you have. It could be the number of textbooks that you purchase. It could be the distance to school. So there's lots of different things that can be variables. So let's try one. I want to know if this is a variable. The number of recs per week at the intersection outside of school. What do you think? Yes, that's a variable. Let's talk about data. Data is the values for a variable from individual observations. So for the previous variable that we were talking about, the number of recs per week at the intersection outside, what could observations be? It could be, did they get in a wreck? Was there not a wreck? How many wrecks? So we would be writing things down like 0, 1, 2, 3. Now there are two types of variables. There is categorical and numerical. Now there are two different types of numerical data, or numerical variables, I should say. We have discrete and continuous. Discrete is something that you're going to count, whereas continuous is something that you're going to measure. But we'll talk a little bit more about that. Let's jump over to categorical variables and let's talk about those. Now, categorical variables, it identifies basic differentiating characteristics of the population. Here, the data is qualitative, meaning it's not going to give us a number answer. So can you name any categorical variables? One could be the color of your shirt or the brand of computer you have. There's lots of different kinds. Let's talk a little bit about numerical variables. Now, numerical variables are observations or measurements taken on numerical values. Here, the data is quantitative. It makes sense to average these values. Now, in numerical variables, there are two types, discrete and continuous. Can you name any numerical variables? Things that are quantitative, that will give you a numerical answer of value. The distance from home or the number of Instagram followers somebody has would be considered numerical variables. Let's talk about the two types, discrete and continuous. Now, discrete are the values of the variable that correspond to isolated points along a number line. It usually counts of an item, so you can count it, right? 1, 2, 3, you can count it. Can you name any discrete variables, things that can be counted? How about the number of Twitter posts today? That would be considered discrete. Let's talk about continuous now. So continuous is a variable that can be any value in a given interval. So it usually means that we're measuring something. Okay, so it's that gap in between. So can you name any continuous variables? Things you might measure. How about the distance between work and home? So discrete variables have values that are integers, whereas continuous variables are all real numbers. Let's practice some. So we're going to identify the following variables. I want to know if they are categorical or numerical. But if they're numerical, then I want to know if they're discrete or continuous. So here's our first one. The color of cars in the teacher's lot. What do you think? Categorical, numerical? Yep, that's going to be categorical because we're talking about colors. You can't average colors together. Let's look at our next one. The number of calculators owned by students at your school. This seems like it would be a number answer to me, so I'm thinking numerical. But the question is, would it be discrete or continuous? So you need to ask yourself, would you measure it or would you count it? I feel like this is something that we would be counting. And so this would be a discrete numerical variable. What about the zip code of an individual? This is going to be a little bit tricky because zip codes are numbers, right? Like 85204 or 90210. But is that something that's being measured or counted, or is it something that's being put into a category? It's categorical. We could just as soon say that zip code A or zip code B or zip code C. What about the amount of time it takes students to drive to school? Would this be categorical or numerical? This would be a continuous numerical. And it's continuous because we're measuring it. Something that can be measured, the amount of time it takes students to drive to school. Let's try one more. How about the appraised value of homes in your city? Now, appraised value means money. So is that going to be categorical or numerical? It's going to be numerical. Now, money can be discrete or continuous depending on the variable. So we need to ask ourselves, when it's talking about appraised value, is money a measurement or a count? And in this particular instance, because of our variable, it is a count. So it is a discrete numerical. Let's talk about classifying variables by the number of variables in a data set. So we're going to start with univariate. A univariate is data that describes a single characteristic of the population. So let's say that we have a PE coach and he records the height of each student in his class. That would be univariate because he's only writing down the height of each student. That's one piece of data. One variable. So we also have something called a bivariate. A bivariate is going to be data that describes two characteristics of the population. So now suppose that same PE coach records the height and the weight of each student in class. This would be considered a bivariate because there are two variables being recorded. There's also something called a multivariate. It's a little bit outside of the scope of this class, but I want you to know what it is. It's data that describes more than two characteristics. So now take that same PE coach. So he's recording the height, he's recording the weight, but let's say he also records the number of sit-ups and the number of push-ups for each student in class. So here we have a multivariate set of data.